Brandon Miller drove his car through the dark city. The street lights passed quickly. He had been drinking a lot at the work party. His eyes were heavy, and he couldn't drive in a straight line. Other people on the street saw Brandon's car driving from one side to the other. They were worried and called the police. They said there was a dangerous car on the street. Officer John was in his patrol car when he heard the call over the radio. He went to look for the car that people talked about. It didn't take long to see Brandon's car making strange turns. John turned on the car's siren and lights. It took Brandon a while to realize he needed to stop. When he saw the flashing lights behind him, Brandon became nervous. He knew he had done something wrong. Brandon's car stopped on the shoulder. John parked behind him and got out of the cruiser. He walked to the driver's window. Brandon rolled down the window, trying to look normal. "Good evening, sir," said John. "Can I see your driver's license and car documents, please?" Brandon reached into his pocket and took out the papers. His hands were shaking a little. He handed everything over to John. The police officer looked at the documents carefully. He realized that Brandon was a police lieutenant. John was surprised but didn't change the way he spoke. "Sir, have you had anything to drink today?" John asked. Brandon hesitated. He thought about lying but decided to be honest. "Yes, officer. I had some to drink at the work party." John shook his head, disappointed. "I understand. I'm going to need you to get out of the car so we can do some tests, okay?" Brandon didn't want to leave. He thought that because he was a lieutenant, he wouldn't need to take the tests. "Look, officer, I'm Lieutenant Brandon Miller. I'm sure we can resolve this another way." John became serious. He knew Brandon was trying to use his position to escape. "I'm sorry, sir, but I need you to get out of the car now." Brandon started to get nervous. He didn't want trouble, but he didn't want to be arrested either. "Please, officer. I live near here. Can I go home and forget about this?" John shook his head again. "I can't do this, sir. Please get out of the car." Brandon was quiet for a moment. He looked at John, hoping the officer would change his mind. But John remained firm. "Mr. Miller, I'm asking you once again. Step out of the car, please," John said in a serious voice. Brandon realized he was in a difficult situation. He had two choices: get out of the car and take the tests, or continue refusing and making things worse. While Brandon was thinking, another police car arrived. Officer Mike got out and went to John. They talked quietly for a moment. Mike approached Brandon's car. "Good evening, Lieutenant Miller. We need you to get out of the car now." Brandon looked at the two police officers. He knew he was wrong, but he didn't want to admit it. "Look, guys, let's talk about this. We're all cops here." John and Mike looked at each other. They didn't want to use force, but Brandon wasn't cooperating. "Sir, this is your last chance," John said. "Get out of the car now, or we'll have to take you out by force." Brandon was silent. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, as if that would stop the police from pulling him out of the car. John and Mike waited a little longer. They gave Brandon several chances to go out on his own, but he continued to sit, not moving. The police realized they had to act. They didn't want to hurt Brandon, but they needed to do their job. "Okay, Mr. Miller," said John. "You had your chance. We're going to have to get you out of the car now." Brandon started to panic. He didn't believe this was happening. As a police lieutenant, he never imagined he would be on the other side of the law. John and Mike prepared to open the car door. The situation had become too serious. What had started as a simple stop on the road and was now a big problem. As the officers approached the door, Brandon finally realized the gravity of what he had done. He had put others in danger by driving drunk. And now he was disrespecting his co-workers. The night that started with a joyous party was about to end in a way Brandon never expected. The choices he made would have serious consequences, not only for his career but for his entire life. Brandon Miller felt his heart pound in his chest. He was gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. Officers John and Mike were standing next to the car, waiting for it to leave. "Lieutenant Miller, please exit the vehicle now," John said in a firm voice. Brandon looked at the two police officers. He knew he had done something wrong, but he didn't want to admit it. In his head, he still thought he could escape this situation. "Look, guys," Brandon said, trying to smile. "We're all police officers here. Let's talk about this. I'm sure we can resolve it without any problems." John and Mike looked at each other. They didn't like this situation. It was difficult having to arrest a fellow police officer, especially a lieutenant. But they knew they had to do the right thing. Sir Mike spoke calmly. "We understand that you are a lieutenant. But that doesn't change the fact that you were driving dangerously. Many people called 911 concerned. We need to follow standard procedure." Brandon felt butterflies in his stomach. He didn't know that other people had seen him driving badly. That made everything more serious. "I only drank a little," Brandon tried to explain. "It was just at the work party. I didn't think it would affect that much." John shook his head. "Mr. Miller, drinking and driving is always dangerous no matter the amount. Please step out of the car so we can perform a field sobriety test." Brandon was quiet for a moment. He knew that if he took the test, he would probably be arrested. But if he continued to refuse, things could get even worse. "Look," Brandon said, trying one more time. "What if I leave the car here and take a taxi home? I promise I won't drive anymore today." Mike sighed. He understood why Brandon was trying to escape, but he couldn't let that happen. "I'm sorry, Lieutenant," Mike replied. "We can't do this. You need to get out of the car now." Brandon started to get nervous. He looked around as if looking for a way out. But there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in a situation he created. "You guys don't understand," Brandon said, his voice getting louder. "I'm a good cop. I've never done anything wrong before. This is going to ruin my career." John leaned closer to the car window. "Mr. Miller, we understand your concern. But think about the other people on the road. What if you had hurt someone? As a police officer, you know we have to protect people." John's words hit Brandon like a punch. He had never thought about it. What if he had hit another car? What if he had hurt a child? The thought made his stomach turn. I didn't think of that," Brandon muttered, feeling embarrassed. "We know you don't," Mike said gently. "But that's why we need you to get out of the car now. We need to make sure you're okay to drive." Brandon looked at the two police officers. He saw the concern in their eyes. They didn't want to hurt him or ruin his career. They were just doing their job, just like he would if he were in their shoes. Slowly, Brandon let go of the steering wheel. His hands were shaking. "Okay," he said quietly. "I am going out." John and Mike stepped back, giving Brandon room to open the door. Carefully, Brandon got out of the car. His legs were wobbly, and he had to lean on the car to keep from falling. "Thank you for cooperating," Sir John said. "Now let's do some simple tests, okay?" Brandon nodded, feeling defeated. He knew he wouldn't pass the tests. The alcohol had affected his balance and coordination. John explained the tests Brandon would have to take. He would have to walk in a straight line, touch his nose with his finger, and stand on one leg. It seemed easy, but Brandon knew it would be difficult. As Brandon tried to run the tests, Mike watched closely. He could see that the lieutenant was struggling to maintain his balance. It was clear he had drunk too much to drive. After the tests, John looked at Mike and gave a small nod. They both knew what had to be done. "Lieutenant Miller," John said in a serious voice, "based on the tests and your behavior, we have reason to believe you are driving under the influence. I'm going to have to ask you to accompany us to the police station for further testing." Brandon felt like the world was spinning. He never imagined he would be on the other side of the law. As a police lieutenant, he was always responsible for arresting people, not being arrested. "Please," Brandon begged one last time. "Don't do that. I promise I'll never drink and drive again. Just let me go home." John and Mike looked at each other again. They could see the pain in Brandon's eyes. But they also knew they had a greater responsibility. "I'm sorry," Sir Mike said softly. "But we have to follow procedure. It's for your safety and the safety of everyone on the road." With a heavy sigh, Brandon let his shoulders slump. He knew he had lost. His choices that night had led to this moment, and now he would have to face the consequences. John took the handcuffs from his belt. "Lieutenant Brandon Miller, you are under arrest for driving under the influence. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court." As John read him his rights, Brandon looked up at the starry sky above. He thought about his family, his co-workers, all the people who trusted him. How would he explain this? How could he fix the mistake he had made? Mike gently guided Brandon to the police cruiser. Before getting into the car, Brandon took one last look at his own vehicle. That decision to drive after drinking had changed everything. He knew his life would never be the same again. As the squad car drove away, taking Brandon to the police station, John and Mike were silent. They knew they had done the right thing, but that didn't make the situation any easier. Seeing a fellow officer fall like that was painful for everyone. At the police station, Brandon would be subjected to more tests. His blood alcohol level would be measured, and the truth about how much he had drunk would be revealed. But more than that, the truth about his choices and their consequences would be exposed for all to see. The night that began with a joyous party had ended with Brandon in the back seat of a police cruiser. It was a stark reminder that no one is above the law, not even those who enforce it. Brandon sat in the cold chair in the interrogation room. The bright lights made him blink. He looked at his hands, which were shaking a little. He never imagined he would be on this side of the table. Officer John entered the room with a paper in his hand. He looked tired and a little sad. "Lieutenant Miller," John said in a calm voice, "the blood alcohol test results are back." Brandon looked up. He knew the outcome wouldn't be good, but a part of him still hoped for a miracle. "His blood alcohol level was 0.27, John continued. "That's more than 3 times the legal limit." Brandon closed his eyes and lowered his head. He knew he had drunk, but he didn't imagine it was that much. I didn't know it was this bad," Brandon muttered. John sat in the chair across from Brandon. "Lieutenant, you know what that means, don't you?" Brandon nodded slowly. He knew very well. As a police officer, he had arrested many people for driving drunk. Now he was the one being arrested. "Am I going to have to stay here tonight?" Brandon asked, his voice low and embarrassed. John sighed. "Yes, Lieutenant. You will be held in custody until your hearing with the judge tomorrow morning." Brandon felt a lump in his throat. He thought about his family, his co-workers. What would they say when they found out? Can I call my wife?" Brandon asked. John nodded. "Of course. I'll take you to the phone." As they walked down the hallway of the police station, Brandon saw some police officers he knew. They looked away, avoiding looking at him. Brandon felt shame and regret. On the phone, Brandon tried to keep his voice steady as he spoke to his wife, Sarah. "Sarah, I did something very wrong," he said, fighting back tears. "I got arrested for drunk driving." On the other end of the line, Sarah was silent for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was full of worry and disappointment. "Oh, Brandon, how could you do that? What about the kids? What are we going to tell them?" Brandon felt tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I'm really sorry. I wasn't thinking straight." After hanging up the phone, Brandon was taken to a cell. He sat on the hard bed, staring at the gray walls. He had never felt so alone and regretful. The next morning, Brandon was taken to his hearing before the judge. He was wearing his prison uniform, something he never imagined he would wear. The judge looked at Brandon with a serious look. "Lieutenant Brandon Miller, you are being charged with driving under the influence. How do you plead?" Brandon swallowed. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said in a low voice. The judge shook his head, disappointed. "Lieutenant Miller, as an officer of the law, you are supposed to be an example to the community. Your actions have put not only your life at risk, but the lives of other drivers and pedestrians." Brandon lowered his head, feeling the weight of the judge's words. "Considering your position as a police officer and the high level of alcohol in your blood, I am setting bail at $10,000. Additionally, your driving license is suspended immediately." Brandon heard the terms with a knot in his stomach. He knew he deserved the punishment, but that didn't make it any easier to accept. After the hearing, Brandon was taken back to the police station to be released. Sarah was waiting for him, her face a mix of worry and disappointment. "Brandon," she said softly when she saw him. "Let's go home." On the way home, the silence in the car was heavy. Brandon looked out the window, seeing the streets of the city he swore to protect. Now he felt as if he had betrayed that promise. When they got home, the children ran to the door. They stopped when they saw their parents' serious faces. "Daddy," the youngest daughter Emily asked, "are you well?" Brandon knelt down, hugging his children. "Kids, Daddy did something very wrong. I drove when I shouldn't have, and now I have to face the consequences." The children looked at him, confused and worried. Brandon felt his heart sink. How could he explain to them what he had done? That night, after the kids went to bed, Brandon and Sarah sat in the living room. The silence between them was heavy. "What's going to happen now?" Sarah finally asked. Brandon sighed. "I don't know for sure. I'll probably be suspended from work. Maybe I'll even lose my job." Sarah took his hand. "We'll get through this together, Brandon. But you need to promise you'll never do anything like that again." Brandon looked into his wife's eyes. "I promise, Sarah. Never again. I'll fix this somehow." In the days that followed, Brandon faced the consequences of his actions. He was placed on unpaid administrative leave while an internal investigation was conducted. His co-workers treated him differently now. Some avoided looking at him, others looked at him with disappointment. Brandon felt the weight of his actions every moment. At home, he tried to be the best father and husband he could. He helped the children with their homework, did household chores, anything to show that he was sorry and wanted to change. A week after the incident, Brandon was called into a meeting with the police chief. His heart was pounding as he entered the room. The boss looked at Brandon with a mix of disappointment and compassion. "Lieutenant Miller, do you understand the gravity of what you did?" Brandon nodded. "Yes, sir, I completely understand." The boss sighed. "Brandon, you were a good police officer for many years, but your actions that night were inexcusable. We cannot have someone in a leadership position who does not respect the laws they are supposed to enforce." Brandon felt his stomach sink. He knew what was coming. "You are being demoted to a support role," the boss continued. "Your salary will be reduced and you will have to undergo a rehabilitation program. If you successfully complete the program and show true contrition, we may reconsider your position in the future." Brandon accepted the punishment without argument. He knew it could have been much worse. As he left his boss's office, Brandon felt relieved that he still had a job, but also embarrassed about the demotion. He knew he had a long way to go to regain the trust of his colleagues and the community. That night, Brandon sat down with his family and told them about the outcome of the meeting. The children didn't fully understand, but they knew something important had changed. "Dad is going to work in a different position for a while," he explained. "But this will give me more time to spend with you guys." Sarah squeezed his hand, showing her silent support. As he looked at his family, Brandon made a silent promise. He would learn from this mistake, grow from it, and become a better man. Not just for himself, but for his family and the community he swore to protect. The road ahead would be difficult, but Brandon was determined to face it. One day at a time, he would work to regain the confidence he had lost and to be the example he always should have been. Brandon woke up early that morning. The sun had barely risen, but he was already up. He looked out the window and saw the empty streets. Everything seemed calm outside, but inside him there was a storm of feelings. Today was his first day back at work after what happened. But it wasn't the same work as before. Brandon was no longer a lieutenant. Now he had a smaller role with fewer responsibilities and less money. Brandon got dressed slowly. He took out his badge and looked at it for a long time. The badge gleamed in the dim morning light. Brandon remembered when he first earned this badge. He was so proud that day. Now, he felt ashamed. In the kitchen, Sarah was making coffee. She smiled at Brandon when he entered. "Good morning," she said fondly. "Are you ready for today?" Brandon tried to smile back, but it was difficult. "I think so," he replied. Sarah placed a cup of coffee in front of him and held his hand. "It's going to be okay," she said. "It's just the first step." Brandon drank his coffee in silence. He thought about all the things that had changed. His work, the way people looked at him, even how he felt about himself. Everything was different now. When it was time to go, Brandon gave Sarah and the kids a kiss. Emily, his youngest daughter, hugged him tightly. "Good luck, Daddy," she said. Brandon felt tears in his eyes, but he didn't let them fall. He needed to be strong today. On his way to work, Brandon saw things he had never noticed before. He saw people going to their jobs, children going to school, the world going on as usual. But for him, nothing was the same. When Brandon arrived at the police station, he stood at the door for a moment. He took a deep breath and entered. Inside, people looked at him. Some quickly looked away. Others greeted him with a nod. Brandon felt the weight of all those looks. The police chief, Mr. Thompson, came to talk to Brandon. "Good morning, Miller," he said. "Let's go to my room." In the boss's office, Brandon sat in the chair in front of the desk. He remembered all the times he had been there before, receiving praise or discussing important cases. Now he felt small and unimportant. "Miller," the boss began, "I know today isn't easy for you. But I want you to know that we're giving you a chance. A chance to show that you've learned from your mistakes and that you can be better." Brandon nodded. "I understand, sir, and I appreciate the opportunity." The boss explained Brandon's new job. He would be at reception, helping people who came to the police station. It wasn't as exciting or important work as before, but it was a start. When he left the boss's office, Brandon went to his new place of work. Reception was small and noisy. There were always people coming and going, phones ringing. Brandon sat in his new chair and looked around. At first, it was difficult. Brandon wasn't used to this kind of work. He made mistakes, got confused with the procedures. Some people who knew him as a lieutenant looked at him with pity or surprise to see him there. But little by little, Brandon began to adapt. He realized that even in this simple job, he could help people. When someone came in scared or sad, Brandon listened patiently. When a lost child was brought to the police station, Brandon calmed him down and helped find his parents. At the end of the day, Brandon was tired but felt like he had done something good. As he was leaving, Chief Thompson stopped him. "How was your first day, Miller?" he asked. Brandon thought for a moment. "It was different, sir. But I think I learned a lot." The boss smiled a little. "Good. Remember, Miller, every day is a chance to be better than yesterday." Brandon went home thinking about those words. When he arrived, Sarah and the children were waiting for him. They had dinner together, and Brandon talked about his day. "Sounds like a good start," Dad said, his eldest son, Tom. Brandon smiled. "Yes, I think it was." That night, after the kids went to bed, Brandon and Sarah sat on the couch. Sarah took Brandon's hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I know it wasn't easy, but you're trying." Brandon looked at his wife, feeling a rush of love and gratitude. "Thank you for staying by my side," he said. "I don't know what I would do without you." In the days that followed, Brandon continued his work at the front desk. Each day got a little easier. He began to meet the people who regularly came to the police station. He learned to deal with different situations. And little by little, he began to feel like he was making a difference, even if in a small way. One day, an elderly woman came to the police station. She was confused and scared, saying someone had stolen her purse. Brandon calmed her, offered her a glass of water, and listened to her story carefully. He helped fill out the report and patiently explained the next steps. As the lady was leaving, she held Brandon's hand. "Thank you, young man," she said. "You were very kind. It's good to know there are still police officers who care." These words touched Brandon deeply. He realized that even though he was no longer a lieutenant, he could still make a difference in people's lives. Over time, Brandon began to see his mistake not just as a punishment, but as an opportunity to grow. He participated in rehabilitation programs, spoke at schools about the dangers of drunk driving, and strived to be a better example for his children and the community. Months passed, and Brandon continued his work at the front desk. He didn't know if he would ever become a lieutenant again, but he discovered that it wasn't that important anymore. What mattered was doing the best I could every day. A year after the incident, Brandon was called into Chief Thompson's office. He walked in, not knowing what to expect. Miller, the boss, said, "I've been watching your work this year. You've shown dedication, humility, and a true desire to improve." Brandon listened silently, his heart pounding. "I think it's time for you to get back to field work," the boss continued. "Not as a lieutenant, not yet, but as a police officer. What do you say?" Brandon felt a mix of emotions: joy, gratitude, a little fear. But most of all, he felt hope. "It would be an honor," Sir Brandon replied. "I promise I won't disappoint." When Brandon walked out of the police station that day, he looked up at the blue sky above. He thought about everything that had happened, how his life had changed. He knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. Brandon got into his car and drove home, eager to tell his family the news. He knew that with their support and his determination to be better, he could face any challenge that came his way. And so, Brandon Miller began a new chapter in his life, no longer defined by his mistakes, but by his courage to face them and grow.